I'm Dr. Karlos K. Professor of History and Black Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In my presentation, I will discuss Juneteenth Explained, a tradition of remembrance and revival. There are three objectives that I want to discuss today in my presentation. I want to discuss first the history of Juneteenth. And the history of Juneteenth within the tradition of Emancipation Day celebrations in the United States, but also in the broader Atlantic world. I also want to discuss the evolving meaning and significance of Juneteenth celebrations over time, because the way in which Juneteenth was celebrated in 1866 is not the same way that it's celebrated today. So it's important for us to talk about how this tradition has evolved over time. Lastly, I want to discuss why Juneteenth as a Black-derived observance should be celebrated by all Americans, not just Black Americans. So those are our three objectives today. And I have about 4 key points that I would like to make. The first is, and I think this is perhaps for me the most critical point, emancipation. The process of emancipation in the United States was not a passive process. Enslaved people took an active role in securing their emancipation, right? They were not simply passengers on the train of emancipation. They were actually drivers. They were driving the process of emancipation. And so we have to keep that in mind as we talk about Juneteenth and as we talk about Emancipation Day celebrations more broadly. What's a second, and I think also critical point that I want to make is that when we talk about Emancipation Day celebrations, when we think about and talk about Juneteenth, we have to think about this as a way for enslaved people to give meaning, right, to their experience, right, to mark their experience. And so so what Juneteenth is really about are the ways in which, the creative ways in which enslaved people tried to give meaning to the experience of slavery as well as emancipation. And so we need to understand them as trying to create a kind of memory of emancipation through holidays such as Juneteenth. Now, the reason why this is so important is that in a context in which Black people have been enslaved for hundreds of years in this country, Juneteenth wasn't just about commemorating and remembering what was and just the excitement of what could be. It was truly a way, right, for enslaved people to affirm their new status as free people, as free citizens. And so Juneteenth really in many ways was this public political act that was meant to try to help enslaved people claim and affirm, right, their new status as free people. And so what I want to share with you today is that Juneteenth emerges out of many different ending points of slavery and during the Civil War period. Juneteenth, though, emerges as the critical one that we celebrate, the one that we in fact remember today to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. And so these are the main points that I want to try to convey today. But before I sort of get into sort of Juneteenth and how Juneteenth as an observance for the end of slavery, how it evolved over time and what it means today, is really important for me to sort of establish context. And the key context that we need to understand is slavery and the importance of slavery to the United States. And so when we think about slavery, we tend to think about it as slaveholders and masters, overseers. We tend to think about these very defined roles. And in some ways, in thinking about slavery in that way, we kind of miss the point, because what slavery revolved around, chattel slavery in particular revolved around, is the buying and selling of human beings. That is what slavery was about. And so when we talk about it, we have to talk about it as not this labor system, right, which it was, but at the core of what slavery is, it's the buying and selling of human beings. It's the assigning of monetary value to human life. And so this system of assigning value to monetary value to the lives of humans, and buying and selling them in public markets, this played a defining role in US politics, economics, and culture for nearly 250 years, from 1619 to 1865. Slavery was so important to US politics, economics, and culture that between 1789 and 1850, 10 of the first 12 US presidents had been or were active slaveholders when they were elected to office. And so what that tells us is that to hold slaves in American society was common. And not only was it common, during this period, the United States Congress, year after year, decade after decade, passed legislation that protected the right to buy and sell human beings, to own human beings, to assign monetary value to human beings. That was common during the 250 years of American history prior to emancipation. And so we really need to understand how central slavery is to the country. Just to go a little bit deeper here, slavery was certainly a fixture in American life and American politics, but when it comes to the economy, we really see how significant slavery was to this country. And so during the 1800s, cotton that was planted and picked by enslaved people accounted for more than half, approximately 60% of US exports. And the cumulative value of enslaved labor, which is estimated about $3.5 billion in today's dollars, so no small amount, exceeded that of all US railroads and factories combined. And so what that means is that enslaved people were the single most valuable asset in the US economy. That's how important slavery was to this country's development. And so in 1860, there were more than 4 million enslaved Blacks in the United States, mostly concentrated in the South. And so in 1860, slavery was the most important institution economically to this country, in terms of its politics, and I would even argue in terms of its culture, how America thought about itself in so many ways revolved around slavery. And so it's really important for me to establish this context so that we understand what emancipation represented. And so one of the things that's also really important to me, beyond talking about emancipation and when it occurred and why we commemorate it, is the process of emancipation. And so one of the points that I led with was that enslaved people were active in their own emancipation. They were not passive recipients of emancipation. They actually were active agents in generating and initiating even the process of emancipation during the Civil War. And so what I want to talk about is the concept of a general strike. And this is a term that was coined by the great African-American historian W.E.B. Du Bois, in his great book, Black Reconstruction. He talks about in his history of the Civil War and Reconstruction, he talks about the ways in which enslaved people engaged in a general strike against slavery. And he couches this in a discussion of slave runaways, as well as slave conspiracies during the Civil War, to help us to understand the active role that enslaved people played in generating and initiating and enforcing even President Abraham Lincoln in creating an Emancipation Proclamation. And so what Du Bois really focused on is that during the era of slavery, there were few avenues for enslaved Blacks to gain their freedom. Some enslaved Blacks were able to purchase their freedom or buy their freedom, from their owner, and in buying their freedom, later they were able to buy the freedom of family members who may have remained in slavery after they were able to free themselves. And so buying one's freedom was perhaps the way in which enslaved people were most likely to free themselves, besides running away. But because of the very narrow sort of avenues by which enslaved people could free themselves, particularly prior to the Civil War, when we think about the Civil War era and this very chaotic situation that the country finds itself in, a civil war, and this sort of conflict, but also the chaos that the conflict creates openings for enslaved people to actually flee, right, from particular areas in the South. And so the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that enslaved people did not wait for slavery to be formally abolished in 1863 or in 1865. As soon as the first shots of the Civil War are fired, thousands of enslaved people began to flee Southern plantations en masse. And in some cases, and in a few documented cases, enslaved people rebelled against their enslavers. And so for these reasons, this is why historian, and as I mentioned, historian and the pioneering sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois referred to, enslaved people fleeing Southern plantations en masse as a kind of labor strike or a general strike against slavery. In sort of utilizing sort of the imagery of labor activism, what Du Bois is really trying to help us to understand is the real active role that enslaved people played in their own liberation. And so they weren't waiting for an Emancipation Proclamation. They weren't waiting to hear the latest news that was being reported about Lincoln's slow evolution towards emancipation. They weren't waiting for those assurances. They used the opportunity, the chaos and the openings, right, that the chaos created for them to abscond, right, and to even if it was only momentary, to free themselves from enslavement. And so the active role that enslaved people play in the process, very, very important. So now that we have that context, I really just want us to understand how slave emancipation unfolded during the Civil War. And so for enslaved Blacks who did not abscond from slavery and gain, freedom through those means, formal freedom for enslaved people during the Civil War era emerged at different times. And so because it emerged at different times for different populations of enslaved people, there have been several dates, right, that have marked the end of slavery in the US. And so that's what I really want to turn to. I want us to understand that there are multiple dates that enslaved people within the United States as well as enslaved people outside of the United States kind of used to mark the end of slavery. And so I would be remiss if I did not mention August 1st, and particularly August 1st, 1834, when Britain, or Great Britain, if we're talking about the empire, abolished slavery in in all of their colonies and territories under their control. And so all told, more than 800,000 Africans gained their freedom because of the abolition of slavery and the slave trade in all of the territories, the areas controlled by the British Empire. And so August 1st, 1834, particularly for the enslaved population under British control, is the end of slavery for them and their sort of most important Emancipation Day. And prior to the end of slavery in the United States, August 1st was celebrated by particularly free Blacks in the United States because of what it perhaps portended for the United States. And so even for African Americans, August 1 was a really important date, marking at minimum the end of slavery and the slave trade in the British Empire. And so when we think about and sort of get really specific about the particular endings of slavery during the Civil War, there are three or four that I think are really important. And so first and foremost, we have to talk about April 16, 1862, when slavery was abolished in Washington, D.C. In abolishing slavery in D.C., that meant that roughly about 3,100 enslaved Blacks gained their freedom. And so April 16th, for that population of enslaved people, is their true emancipation date. However, if we fast forward just a few months after that, September 22nd, 1862, President Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And for some, this was, if not the beginning of emancipation, signaled the beginnings of emancipation. And so for many, or for some, September 22nd, 1862 marks the end of slavery in America, or at least the beginnings of the end of slavery in America. Now, January 1, 1863, for many marks, and particularly in the Civil War era, marked the end of slavery, because it is when the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. And the Emancipation Proclamation, in brief, abolishes slavery in all areas in rebellion against the United States. And so the 11 states, Confederate states that were in rebellion against the United States, though in those areas, slavery was thenceforth abolished. However, slavery remained intact in slaveholding states that had remained loyal to the Union. And so that was another 4 states in which there was slavery, right? They remained loyal. And so therefore the Emancipation Proclamation had no impact on slavery in those areas. It was only on December 6, 1865, that the 13th Amendment that formally abolished slavery went into effect, because December 6, 1865, the 27th state, you needed 27 states to ratify the 13th Amendment in order for it to go into effect. And Georgia, on December 6, 1865, is the 27th state to ratify the 13th Amendment. And so on that date, the 13th Amendment takes hold, or takes effect. And so for many, December 6th is when formally, slavery as an institution, the buying and selling of human beings, right, formally comes to an end, not with necessarily the Emancipation Proclamation or the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation or even the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. on April 16, 1862. And so the point here is that there were multiple endings of slavery during the Civil War, but somehow we have sort of coalesced around a different date, Juneteenth, as marking the official end of slavery. And so that's what I want us to kind of turn to next. Before I get there, though, I really want to just take a moment to talk about Emancipation Day celebrations during the Civil War era. And what we sort of need to understand about these Emancipation Day celebrations is that they were truly joyous moments. These were moments in which enslaved people recognize and begin to realize that they will no longer be bought and sold, torn apart from their families, whipped mercilessly for not working fast enough. Right? They recognize in these moments, this moment, there's going to be a different reality for them. And so oftentimes when enslaved people talked about emancipation, they didn't use the word emancipation, they used the word jubilee because of the great joy that freedom brought to them because of the stark realities that would not be revisited upon them going forward. And so when we think about these Emancipation Day celebrations, we have to think about them as extremely cathartic, joyous moments. And so at midnight on January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. Remember, President Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. And this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation gave the Confederacy essentially 3 months to decide whether they would surrender. And if they surrendered, slavery in the Confederacy or the states of the Confederacy would be left untouched. They could come back into the Union without slavery touched. However, if they did not surrender by January 1, 1863, slavery would be abolished. Slavery as a bargaining tool would be taken off the table in any negotiations or attempted truce between the sides. And so the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation created some states. And so it gave until midnight, December 31st, 1862, for the Confederacy to surrender, and they did not. And so enslaved people and then free Blacks around the country waited until midnight to hear whether or not the Confederacy would surrender. And if in surrendering, that would seal their fate. Or if they did not, create freedom, liberation for millions of enslaved people. And so literally down to the moments comes over the wire that the Confederacy has not surrendered and the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. And so literally at midnight, there are joyous screams, yells, cheers throughout the streets of American cities like Boston and Philadelphia, that freedom has come. But it only was freedom for enslaved people in areas in rebellion against the United States. We have to always keep that in mind, that even as some enslaved people celebrated, there were others who it did not pertain to that remained legally in bondage in the United States. And so it is a bittersweet moment. Some enslaved people are liberated formally liberated, but then others remain enslaved legally. And so it is a bittersweet marking of the end of one of the ends of slavery in the United States. I say that to help us to understand how significant these moments are. And because these were really significant moments, you had committees that would come together of prominent citizens to create a whole program, an agenda, right, with deep thoughtfulness attached to it to help commemorate the ending of slavery and the beginnings of freedom for Black Americans. And so when we think about these Emancipation Day celebrations, we have to think about former enslaved Blacks, abolitionists, other dignitaries gathering together in day-long and sometimes multi-day long celebrations. We have to think about speeches being made, songs, prayers, hymns. We have to think about the variety of ways in which the community came together to bear witness, to commemorate the end of slavery for a community who many thought, the end of slavery would never come, or at least would not come for many decades. And so, particularly in the Emancipation Day celebration in Boston on January 1, 1864, it brought together the likes of abolitionist Frederick Douglass, who is a towering figure of the 19th century, Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, two of the most important white abolitionists in America prior to the Civil War, and helped to, I would argue, radicalize President Abraham Lincoln and push him toward a more radical posture on slavery during the war. These are the kinds of individuals who would come together to bear witness, to celebrate, to give meaning to, and affirm this new status of enslaved people. As emancipation is occurring. And so when we, in particular, sort of try to dive down a little bit into what occurred and what was said at Emancipation Day celebrations, I want to share with you a quote from William C. Nell, who was the president of the association that oversaw the Boston Emancipation Day sort of commemoration. And so William C. Nell, who gave a speech at the Tremont Temple in Boston on January 1, 1864, he stated, quote, "New Year's Day, proverbially known throughout the South as Heartbreak Day, from the trials and horrors peculiar to sales and separations of parents and children, husbands and wives. By this proclamation," meaning the Emancipation Proclamation, "is henceforth invested with new significance and imperishable glory." And so what Nell is trying to help us to understand is the ways in which enslaved people's lives have been radically transformed in the ways that I mentioned earlier. Their lives of being separated from their family, husbands and wives, right, has been cast aside. And there's now a new reality that is being born all over the South, or where enslaved people had fled to during the Civil War. And so for him, there was an imperishable glory attached to this moment. And so again, these Emancipation Day celebrations were these moments where enslaved people, as well as their allies, try to explain, understand, comprehend, right, this moment and how the transformative moment that it was and what it meant for enslaved people and the country. And so now that we kind of have this context that there are multiple Emancipation Days that occurred during the Civil War, I want to shift our attention to Juneteenth. And I want to shift our attention to talking about the end of slavery in Texas and how that how that is related to the origins of Juneteenth in our commemoration. So on April 9th, 1865, the Civil War comes to an end, but slavery remains intact in several border states such as Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. And slavery remains intact in these states because these are the states, while they were slaveholding, had remained loyal to the federal government. And so slavery, April 9th, 1865, has not come to an end, even though the Civil War does abruptly come to an end on that date. Now, the reason why I'm explaining this is this becomes really important for the end of slavery in Texas. And so because slavery had remained in effect in Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, as well as in areas like Texas, where the Emancipation Proclamation did not have the force of military law and military compulsion, in states such as Texas, where many Southern slaveholders fled to during the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation had not gone into effect. And so what that meant is, even after the Civil War has come to an end, a Union general by the name of Gordon Granger had to go to Texas and issue essentially a general order that did what the Emancipation Proclamation had already did on 2.5 years earlier. And so General Granger issues General Order Number 3, which abolishes slavery in Texas on June 19th, 1865. On December 6th, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution goes into effect. And this officially or formally abolishes slavery in the United States. The states that had, remained loyal to the Union, had been slaveholding, but remained loyal to the Union, in those places, slavery is abolished. And so as an institution, right, slavery abolished December 6th, 1865. But nonetheless, that date has not resonated, right, as the end of slavery in the United States. Juneteenth, right, that marks the end of slavery in Texas for that population of enslaved people. That date has come to stand in for the end of slavery in the United States. And I believe a big part of why Juneteenth has stood in for emancipation, for the various moments in which enslaved people gained freedom, is because the ways in which that community has organized and mobilized around commemorating that moment. And so what we know is, a year following Gordon Granger's proclamation, 1 year following that, Black freedmen in Galveston organized the first Juneteenth celebration. And for decades thereafter, there were numerous Juneteenth commemorations in Galveston and Houston, throughout Texas, and ultimately throughout the region. And so it is in part because of the ways in which that particular community organized and mobilized to tell the story of the end of slavery in Texas that it became a stand-in for and representative of these other Emancipation Day celebrations or commemorations that occurred decades before it. And so part of why Juneteenth is such a prominent observance in the United States today, I would argue, but really is about the ways in which, freedmen initially, but then the descendants of freedmen continued a tradition of commemorating and celebrating Juneteenth. But I think what has propelled it to national attention has been the efforts at the state level, and particularly the state of Texas, and activists within Texas who pushed to make Juneteenth an official state holiday. And so June 7th, 1979, Texas became the first state to make Juneteenth a state holiday. And in the 40 or so years since then, more than 40 states, and in fact, I believe only one state today in the United States doesn't celebrate Juneteenth. So 49 states celebrate Juneteenth. And as I mentioned earlier, there has been legislation in Congress over the last week around Juneteenth. Both Congress and the Senate approved making Juneteenth, after 80 years of sort of it being a state holiday or a corporate holiday. It will be a federal holiday, a national holiday. And so that creates certain implications for how we think about and talk about Juneteenth going forward. As a Black holiday or a Black derived holiday, I think increasingly it's going to be seen because of this as an American holiday. And so I want to talk about the implications of that and why that makes sense to me. Before I do that, I do want to make sure to sort of really clearly explain Juneteenth as a kind of remembrance and the kind of work that it does as a commemoration or a remembrance. And so we always have to remember that in the initial decades in which either there were Emancipation Day celebrations or Juneteenth celebrations, front and center in those commemorations were oftentimes former enslaved people, Black veterans who told stories about their experience and helped particularly younger generations, future generations, understand their heritage. And so there was a transmission of information and education in those, I think, initial decades in terms of the work that these Emancipation Day celebrations, Juneteenth, kind of did. And while remembrance and education was sort of always central to these celebrations, these joyous celebrations, they were also always about a moment of bringing the community together and reflecting on present day oppression, present day racial inequality that stemmed from slavery or was connected to the experience or the history of slavery in this country. And so when we think about Juneteenth celebrations or commemorations during the 19th century, right? They were always public. And in being public, they were always, past, looking backward, but also looking forward, thinking about, what hurdles, barriers that stem from slavery that still had to be overcome. And so in that way, the more modern Juneteenth celebrations, particularly in the Black Lives Matter era, have become these moments of, I would argue, a political revival, or they're these moments of radical possibility when the community comes together and deeply reflect about the work that stems from slavery that needs to be confronted in the present moment. And so when we think about Juneteenth, we have to think about it as a moment of remembrance, but also as a moment of revival and radical possibility. And so when we think about Juneteenth, and particularly as it becomes a federal holiday, I think it raises a question of who does this belong to, right? And I've laid out, I think, in brief, that this was an observance, this was a holiday that was most deeply felt, right? And has been most deeply felt by enslaved people because of the ways in which emancipation represented this dramatic but also refreshing reality. Even in saying that, um, the institution of slavery was far reaching, right? And slavery touched everyone and every institution in this society. And so slavery and the ending of slavery really belongs to all of us. It really does belong to all of us. And we should all be celebrating its demise because of the ways in which it expanded freedom and it expanded democracy for this country. And so, what I want to emphasize this question: who's Juneteenth? It should be all of ours. And so, the best evidence that I could present to you in terms of how over time Juneteenth has increasingly belonged to more and more Americans, I would just begin with the ways in which since Texas, made Juneteenth a state holiday in 1979, 1980, 48 states, 49 states just recently have recognized it as a state holiday or an observance. In June 2020, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee introduced Juneteenth National Independence Day bill to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. Although the bill was unsuccessful in 2020, on June 17th, 2021, President Joe Biden signed into law the bill making Juneteenth a federal holiday. And so there's a history of us very slowly as Americans realizing that this history is not just localized to Black Americans. This is a history and experience that is very important to the American story. And so therefore, this should be a national federal holiday. I want to just sort of, kind of begin to close out with, just a couple of points, just to reinforce this idea that Juneteenth should belong to all of us. July 4th is a really important day, and for many, a sacred day in American history, when America formally declared independence from the British Empire. And so that moment marked not when Americans were truly independent, formally independent from British, severed ties with Britain. That came later. 1776, July 4th, 1776 was about declaring independence, and the moment of declaration signaled our independence, whether it was won or not. And so in the same way, Emancipation Day celebrations, right? Those different days that mark the ending of slavery for Black communities in the United States, they also mark the attainment of freedom and citizenship rights. And so, in the same way that we think about July 4th, right, as a kind of national holiday that we should all celebrate, even though the July 4th did not mean freedom for enslaved people. In just that same way, we should think about Juneteenth and other emancipation days as marking, right, the expansion of freedom, right, and citizenship rights in America. And that should matter, right, to all of us.